My first son was actually born in Orange County in Anaheim, just 3 miles from Disneyland. So he was a product of that as well. I think he was conceived there too. Anyway, what drives urban sprawl in the United States? Rising population or falling population density? This is a topic that I find very interesting because, can everyone read this? At the time of the first Earth Day, nearly 50 years ago, this wasn't the case. So we have this gentleman speaking, not unlike myself here, except that he's got a bow tie as opposed to a shirt on. And now for religious and political reasons, let's pretend that none of these are related to overpopulation. Energy crisis, food crisis, environmental crises, water crisis. I think we can all speak to some of those. And I might say in this case, urban sprawl and everything that that leads to. As I say, at the time of the first Earth Day in 1970, I was just in high school, but I was well aware of the message and well aware of the population component of that message. Senator Gaylord Nelson, former governor of Wisconsin and U.S. senator from that state, is considered the founder or father of Earth Day. He was deeply, deeply concerned about population until his dying day in 2005. And part of what was driving that concern in the US and around the world at that time was this exponential curve here that I'm not sure you can read the numbers on in the lower right, but from a population at the time of the first census in 1790 of 4 million, by 1970 we had grown to 203 million. We're now at about 325 million, for those of you who keep up with these things. So it was very much at the heart of the environmental movement, the conservation/environmental movement in the late 60s and early 70s. Paul Ehrlich published his book, The Population Bomb, in 1968. Rachel Carson published her book, Silent Spring, in 62, I believe it was. And although she didn't focus on population as a wildlife biologist, she was very much concerned about the impact of humanity on the rest of creation, as it were. So I went into the environmental field as a result of my growing concern about the environmental challenges that the world faces. And population was very much part of my formation. So I spent the next 30 years, right up to the present, I'm still doing this, implementing NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, writing, managing, doing analysis for environmental impact statements and environmental assessments for things like this. Here on the left side, we have a proposed 250 megawatt coal-fired power station in Charlies, Montana, right on the Missouri River near Great Falls. You see, they threw a little bit of wind in there to make it more palatable. So I managed that EIS, which got challenged in court. Final came out in 2007 for the USDA, Montana Department of Environmental Quality. Kennedy Space Center, I did a so-called station-wide programmatic EIS for NASA at Kennedy Space Center, which we just finished up. Here on the left, we have the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers one, that the final of which just came out in December, or last November, for a proposed water supply dam and reservoir in northern Texas to supply water for the growing millions expected north of Dallas in that state in the coming decades. To the right of that is a proposed uranium mine in New Mexico. I'm still working on that EIS for the U.S. Forest Service right now. And then a little more germane, perhaps, and closer to home, I worked on a draft EIS for proposed oil and gas leasing on the Finger Lakes National Forest, just west of us here. A lot of folks probably don't even know that there is a Finger Lakes National Forest as part of I think the Green Mountain National Forest Complex, managed out of Vermont. And then also, fairly close to home, a proposed power line running down the Hudson River. Now that one would actually go into the river itself, be mostly at buried under the bed of the river. So at any rate, I've worked on, managed, and analysis for all types of projects that lead to environmental effects. And I know it always comes up in Chapter 1, the purpose and need, or Chapter 2, the proposed action and alternatives. Well, I should say purpose and need, population growth. It is always there. And yet environmental groups, since that first day, on Earth Day in 1970, have just scurried away from the issue and turned their back on it. So let's look at another type of human impact on the environment. It has many, many manifold impacts. This is a diagram or a map from the US Census Bureau, 2010. Urbanized areas and urban clusters. The urbanized areas are the larger ones. The dots are the urban clusters. They only go up to populations of 5,000, I think. But you can see how densely populated it is east of the Mississippi River. And there it is at night, in that famous satellite image, composite. And you can see why astronomers say that you could be born and die east of the Mississippi River in the United States and never even see the Milky Way your whole life. Now, I've gone to some remote places in the Adirondacks or on the Great Lakes where you can make out a bit of the Milky Way and even Andromeda. M31, the spiral galaxy in Andromeda, 2 million light years away. But it's a rare night that you can do that. You really have to go into those wide open spaces in the west with less pollution, higher elevation, in order to be able to even see the galaxy that surrounds us anymore. So this is spreading, and what is causing that? Here's an example of that spread. These are graphs from the USDA, Natural Resources Conservation Service, showing the growth in US developed land over a 28-year period from 1982 to 2010, running from about 72 million acres in 1982 to 113 million acres by 2010, and again you see that steady growth running along there. And this is just sort of a first level approximation of what it might look like in the year 2100 with the spread of those developed areas. Looking at one particular area a little bit to the south of us, the so-called emerging southern megalopolis in the Piedmont region of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Southern Virginia and Georgia, including Atlanta. John, I'm talking to you. So a study was done a few years ago and published in PLOS One, I think it was. The emerging southern megalopolis. Washington Post, in reporting on this, said that the Southeast could become an overdeveloped megalopolis in the next half century. Giant urban sprawl could pave over thousands of acres of forest and agriculture, connecting Raleigh, North Carolina to Atlanta, Georgia by 2060 if growth continues at its current pace, according to a newly released research paper by the U.S. Geological Survey and North Carolina State University. So here was urban areas in the year 1990. Here's what it looked like by 2010, and here's what it's projected to look like by 2060, according to the paper that you saw in the journal there. Here's a comparison between 2010 and 2060. It is just phenomenal, that degree of development, and this is the path that it is headed on. This area is now being compared to the existing megalopolis in the northeastern states. In fact, it's almost the same size. The green shaded area here was our study area for the Piedmont megalopolis, and the red zones are the existing developed areas here in the northeast. And there's a comparison of the two. The 2010 megalopolis in the northeast and the projected development for 2060 in the Piedmont, from Virginia all the way down to Georgia and even into Alabama, if these current trends continue. So here's what the scientists concluded. A wide range of species and ecosystems will suffer reduced habitat area, and many imperiled species of plants and animals will experience increased difficulty in migration and dispersal. Two examples of a threatened habitat and species: the longleaf pine ecosystem has already been reduced from 92 million acres to 4 million acres over the past century and a half. The red cockaded woodpecker is a federally endangered species. Significant and lasting effects on the region's ecosystems, increasingly fragmented natural landscape, compromise available habitat, truncate or eliminate existing wildlife corridors. The future health of ecosystems is arguably as dependent on urban sprawl as it is human-caused climate warming. And that already concerns biologists, taxonomists, zoologists, botanists to a massive extent. And just more generally, what are some of the environmental consequences of urban sprawl? Well, habitat loss and fragmentation, you can see from a couple of the photos here. You're covering over landscapes, a lot of which are natural or semi-natural habitat that have value in a number of different respects. One of which is for all sorts of species of flora and fauna. In particular, there are a number of imperiled, that is threatened or endangered species that are losing ground as we pave their ground. Here we have 4 from Florida alone: the eastern indigo snake, the Florida panther, the West Indian manatee, and the Florida scrub jay. Traffic congestion and air pollution, of course, sprawl is infamous for doing that. Compromising sustainability by devouring soils and productive farmland. That's one of the big long-term problems. And here's a projection that I did. And again, it's a little bit fanciful. Goes out to 2100. If the collapse scenarios that a lot of us believe are going to happen, this may never happen. We may never get so far. But this is sort of extrapolating existing trends, both in population growth in the United States and declining farmland. So the cropland per capita could drop from as much as 1.9, well, it was 1.9 million acres, 1.9 acres per capita in 1982, 1.2, it had already dropped by about a third by 2010. By 2050, it could go down to 0.7, below an acre per person, and 0.3 by 2100, if you extrapolate these existing trends. I don't think it can happen, but this is the path that we're headed on. Higher energy consumption and fossil fuel dependency, of course. Increased carbon dioxide emissions. Increased water for consumption, or increased water consumption for landscaping and irrigation. And again, I just completed a 9-year environmental impact statement for the Army Corps of Engineers for a proposed water supply dam and reservoir in northern Texas. So I'm well aware of how this demand for municipal water is growing by leaps and bounds. And in the case of this particular EIS, right in Chapter 1 and various appendices, we pointed out that they're using state-of-the-art water conservation and efficiency measures. But when you have the growth that is projected there, it is just not enough to totally offset that projected growth. And yet, environmental groups and the media ignore a big part of this. Says the top quote, sprawl is a Virginia specialty. A federal study says the state is developing its land twice as fast as its population is growing. Again, minimizing the role of population growth. That was an article in the Washington Post in 2001. A letter from the national, or a statement from the National Governors Association in 2000 said the development of suburban land since 1960 has far outpaced population growth in every region of the country. This one, a letter from the president of a large conservation organization, which will go unnamed, to a donor. In most states outside of California, the problem is not population increase, but population distribution. We can have as many people as we want. There's no problem, just distribute them the right way. For example, Portland is often cited. It's not actually a very good example. So, as a result of this, 18 years ago, reading this sort of stuff, a colleague of mine at NumbersUSA, Roy Beck, supported by a lot of, we had like 35 people, about 30 of them with PhDs in the sciences, as our team of advisors on this, one of whom was the late Al Bartlett, the physicist at the University of Colorado, has been quoted here. Garrett Hardin was one of them, a number of others. We began a series of studies just trying to quantify the roles of population growth and what we called per capita sprawl, that is per capita land consumption, because that was the popular conception or misconception that it's just these greedy people in their SUVs and McMansions spreading out into the countryside, paving over everything. They're the cause of the problem. Not that I have much sympathy for folks like that, mind you, but is that the real problem? So again, we did a series of studies. We actually started with one in California, which again, I had lived in from 90 to 95 in Southern California, presented at a conference at the University of Southern California, USC, in 2000. And then we followed it up with a a great one for Florida, overpopulation equals sprawl in Florida. And then we did a national level study in which we looked at the 100 largest urbanized areas as designated by the US Census Bureau in the United States. And we called it weighing sprawl factors in large US cities. How much of this sprawl was due to per capita increase in land consumption? How much of it was due to an increase in population? Followed up, continued in recent years, vanishing open spaces, looking at our national level work again, 15 years after the first one, and then another statewide study, the second one for the state of Florida, vanishing open spaces in Florida, population growth and sprawl in the Sunshine State. We did one on that Piedmont area, when Atlanta and Raleigh collide. A couple of you may have seen my colleague Roy Beck give a presentation on this at the Ecological Society of America conference in Baltimore a couple of years ago. There was the written version of it. Did one recently on Texas. Texas is by far the most sprawling and population intense country, or state in the country right now. You're well aware of that, I'm sure. Yeah, you live it. So the factors in sprawl that we looked at. Growth in per capita land consumption, again, that was the popular idea that this is what is causing sprawl, that is unrelated to population. And then population growth. This is trying to break it down into the two simplest factors. So what that is really a simplified version of the famous IPAT equation, which has been mentioned here, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. Environmental impact, or I, in the equation is equal to population size times affluence times technology, or affluence being income or consumption per capita. And here we're just saying it's per capita and total population. So looking at these two factors on the left, that long list of about 20 items there are many of the factors contributing to a decline in population density, which is the same thing as increasing per capita land consumption. Subsidies, so-called white flight, crime, quality of schools, cheap gasoline, the business sector preferences, housing policies, NIMBYism, a whole number of things. And then on the right, factors contributing to an increasing population in any given area. Births of the native born, immigration, and there's new immigrants, and then births to immigrants, and then internal in-migration within the United States. So that per capita land consumption is the average acreage to provide each resident with housing, schools, healthcare, government buildings, places of work, shopping, arts, recreation, worship, streets, roads, parking, waste treatment systems, everything, not just the homes and the yards, but all of the associated infrastructure. So when we started thinking along these lines, it was like, all right, that's great. We have it conceptualized, but where do we get actual data on this? And we were able to find two incredibly useful, totally different sources of data. One was the US Census Bureau, which since 1950, I believe, has been delineating, going through a painstaking process every 10 years and delineating so-called urbanized areas and urban clusters. The urbanized areas have a population exceeding 50,000, and the urban clusters are between 2,500 and 50,000. That goes back to 1950, as I say, and that's part of the US decadal census efforts. And then totally separate from that, and using a completely different methodology and different terminology, calling it developed land, not urbanized land, the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, through their NRI, the National Resources Inventory, begun in 1982, and originally every 5 years, began developing as part of their overall effort to understand private land in the United States with a particular interest in agriculture, wanted to know, all right, how much land is no longer available for agriculture? So once we had these data sources, then we looked at that, sliced and diced it a number of different ways. Ultimately, we actually found a paper by John Holdren, I'm sure a number of you know him, Population and the Energy Problem, published in the journal Population and Environment in 1991, to be very useful in terms of giving us some math. But we found out you really didn't even need that more physicist type advanced math to do this, to look at the relationship between population growth and increasing consumption of any resource. He was looking at energy, we were looking at land. You get a pretty good idea of the role of population if you take the overall percentage change in population over the overall percentage in change in land area. In almost all cases, growth, but not all cases. So back in 2000, when we first started looking at this, Florida, California, the national level study, the 100 largest urbanized areas, lo and behold, yeah, we have these two factors, and really just by chance, they were pretty much equally responsible for population, which if you go back to those statements I had earlier on, is not all that different from that. It's just that they chose to emphasize that population isn't important at all. It's all just declining population density, increasing per capita land consumption, bigger yards, etc. But we found is about half and half, which seems interesting, if not reasonable. And both of our data sources, entirely different methods of data collection, terminology, came out with similar things. Now look at this top one here, the cities with no population growth. I'm not sure how clear that is. And this is what people, sort of the anti-sprawl campaign, Smart Growth America, the smart growth campaigns would always advertise this sort of thing. Wow, you don't need population at all, population growth at all to have sprawl. And they're absolutely right. Absolutely right. Cities that had no population growth from 1970 to 1990, this was the latest data we had in that early study, had still 26% average sprawl with no population growth at all, or even smaller populations. They still sprawled anyway. And yet, cities that had population growth under 10%, they sprawled 38%. It's a bit different than 26%. Cities with population growth of 10 to 30% in that 20-year period, they had an average of 54% sprawl. Cities that grew by 31 to 50%, 72% sprawl. And cities or urbanized areas that had population growth exceeding 50% had 112% sprawl on average. At the states, it was something similar. States that declined in population, a handful that did, maybe even only one or two that did, like West Virginia during that 20-year period, probably had a declining population. Maybe one or two others, I don't think Michigan yet or Pennsylvania, but so states that declined in population underwent 20% sprawl. Those that 0 to 10% increase, again, and this is a slightly different period, 1982 to 97, so 15-year period, had 0 to 10% population, 26% sprawl. 10 to 20% had 38% sprawl. More than 30% had 46% sprawl. So you see a clear connection there. States that sprawled the most experienced greater population growth than the states that sprawled the least. So the top 10 sprawling states had 19% population growth on average. The bottom 10 sprawlers had 4% on average. So population, again, seems to have made a big difference. So from 1982 to 97, just out of interest for you folks, Texas, you can see it again, and then number one, by far the largest sprawling state in the country in terms of the growth in developed land, over 2.2 million acres in that 15-year period alone, followed by Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, California, the most populous state, but no longer the most rapidly growing. Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was a state that had minimal population growth, but still a fair amount of sprawl because of their land use policies. Ohio and Michigan would be in the same category. So 7 of the 10 states had fairly rapid or very rapid population growth, 3 not so much. So now moving forward a little bit, here are the top sprawling states from 1982 to 2010. 28-year period: Texas, Florida, California, Georgia, and North Carolina. And this is total sprawl for Texas during that 28-year period was 5.5 million acres. And the more recent 8-year period from 2002 to 2010, it was 1.6 million. Some of the top sprawling cities: Atlanta has been infamous for that for years. From just 2000 to 2010, a 10-year period, 683 square miles of sprawl. Dallas, Fort Worth, and Arlington, the designated urbanized area of the U.S. Census Bureau, 372, so just a little more than half of Atlanta, but still a substantial amount. In fact, Texas, I believe, had 4 of the top 10 sprawlers: Dallas, Houston, Austin, and San Antonio. So So, all right, so over this more recent period, 2000 to 2010, and looking at the cities again, the urbanized areas, that is the US Census Bureau data, per capita sprawl, that was the average increase in per capita land consumption, the inverse of declining density, was 4% over that 10-year period. The average person used 4% more land in urbanized areas. However, there was 12% population growth in those same urbanized areas. So what we found overall for the more recent period of 2000 to 2010, the most recent census data in our 2014 study, was that 70% of the new sprawl, the new developed land, was now due to population growth, and 30% was due to per capita sprawl, rising per capita land consumption. So it had changed over that 20 to 30-year period. Population growth is now causing a larger percentage of the overall development in sprawl. And this is both good news and bad news. It means the population is a heavy role, but it also means that we are reducing per capita land consumption, which is considered a net goal of the smart growth movement, of the anti-sprawl movement. You want to try and stop that declining population density. So we're moving in that direction, but the population gains are offsetting those gains. So what are the components of US population growth? The birth rate minus the death rate, which is the natural rate of increase, and then immigration, which is immigration or outmigration, immigration, which is in-migration, minus emigration, out-migration, which is called net migration. Births and deaths can also be broken down into native-born and foreign-born categories. So the US total fertility rate has been at or below the so-called replacement level of 2.1 for about 45 years. That's that number of, it's sort of a demographic construct. Demographers come up with it at any given point. They look at it year by year, and it's the number of children that a woman of at that point in time would have hypothetically if it matched the birth rates of the 5-year cohorts of the population. So again, it's like a theoretical construct, but it's considered replacement level slightly above 2 per woman or 2 per family is the level that would lead to a stable, non-growing, non-falling, non-declining population over time. But it takes, through demographic momentum, it often takes decades to get there. Net migration, on the other hand, has averaged about 1 million plus since the 90s. That's probably 4 to 5 times what out-migration is. The net result is a US population that has been increasing by 25 to 30 million per decade in recent decades, growing with no end in sight. Until about 1990, for about 15 years, the US Census Bureau, as a result of declining birth rates, which went below replacement level the first time in about 1971, I think, for about 15 years, the Census Bureau was projecting a population in the US that would crest, would peak, and then slowly begin to decline. But in 1990-91, they changed that to show growth with no end in sight as a result of rising levels of immigration. So the Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C., Pew Hispanic Center, very respected demographers there, says that the nation is projected to grow to 441 million by 2065. We're at about 325 million right now, and 88% of the increase is linked to future immigrants and their descendants. And then here are 3 projections that deal with that sort of issue. Again, these projections assume a continuing TFR, fertility rate, of replacement or just below. We're at 1.7 right now, quite a bit below replacement level of 2.1. Whereas the major determinant of growth in the United States, as opposed to other countries, is high net migration. So if we keep at the current levels of migration by 2100, and that's at about 1.25 million net per year, by the year 2100, we would be at 524 million Americans, over 500 million, up to about 200 million from where we're at right now. If some proposals for so-called immigration reform were to go ahead, that could rise, and it were to increase to 2 million plus per year, that could rise to 670 million. and as you can see, growing very rapidly with no end in sight. If it were to be reduced to a more traditional level of 250,000 a year, 0.25 million, our population would still continue to grow from the 325 million at present by about another 50 million or so, and would have stabilized by about 2100 at 379 million. So again, I want to caution you that these are projections. These aren't predictions. No one can say what is going to happen. And demographers know only too well just how changeable the assumptions that they put into their demographic models are. But this is what the U.S. is faced with. And if that were to happen, unless densities increase a lot higher than they have been in recent decades, we're going to see a lot more of the sort of impacts that I indicated to you earlier. So the findings that we've had reinforce the findings of the Population and Consumption Task Force of President Clinton's Council on Sustainable Development back in 1996. Quote, "The size of our population and the scale of our consumption are essential determinants of whether the U.S. will be able to achieve sustainability." From the 1996 interim report of the Population and Consumption Task Force, Council on Sustainable Development. Goal number one of the U.S. should be to stabilize our population as early as possible in the next century. And that hasn't happened because population is an extremely complex and politicized issue. And I wanted to bring it up to this group because it's an example of an issue that there's no getting away from, and yet even the environmental groups themselves have walked away from this issue because it is just too difficult. We've got abortion on the one hand, we've got coercion on another hand, alleged coercion, we've got the immigration issue, migration issues in general, all of which makes this issue very, very difficult to face up to. And yet there are consequences from not doing that. I had an interesting conversation with a Peruvian journalist about 10 years ago, telling him that I had worked a lot on population issues, and he said to me, you know, and I've lived in Latin America. My ex-wife is Honduran. I met her when I was in the Peace Corps, so I speak Spanish pretty fluently. I'm pretty well versed in the realities of Latin America. He said to me, you know, we used to talk a lot about population in our country, and you hardly ever hear about it anymore. And yet that's not to say that there isn't a lot to be satisfied with, too. The total fertility rate globally is about half of what it was 50 years ago. Major progress in countries as different as China and Iran and Brazil. A lot of those countries are sub-replacement level fertility right now. Our problem would be 5 times worse if that problem hadn't been made, and yet it's not going away. Recent data from the Population Reference Bureau in Washington, D.C., the UN Population Division, the U.S. Census Bureau, on the annual increment in world population growth shows that it is actually going up again overall. It had dropped to about 70 million per year. Now we're in the 80 to 90 million range yet again. And yet groups don't talk about it anymore. Politicians don't talk about it anymore. It is a third rail of politics.
When did the change, when did that reversal take place?
It took, by 2000, Roy Beck and I had written a paper about this called The Environmental Movement's Retreat from Addressing Population. So it had happened by then. It happened over that 30-year period. As I say, in 1970, the US, and I think in a lot of other countries, there were 3 UN population conferences. The last one took place in Cairo in '94.
In 1972, President's Commission on Population.
Well, yeah, in the US, we had, under President Nixon, there was the Rockefeller Commission, which in 1972 came out with a report saying that the US would be better off stabilizing its population using voluntary means. Nixon backed away from it because of the abortion issue. They also advocated for increased abortion rights, right, which was very contentious. He was trying to get the Catholic vote. So Richard Nixon, believe it or not, actually delivered an address to Congress on the population issue in 1968, I believe it was, same year that Ehrlich published his book. It's unthinkable that any politician would do anything like that now, from the left or the right. The issue has become radioactive for both the political left and the political right. And yet the problem hasn't gone away. You know, just because we won't talk about it or stick our head in the sands, it's continuing. and with impact. So anyway, thank you. I'll take a few questions.